Welcome back, guys, and today we're going to be talking about muscle mastery, the 3 phases of muscle growth and why muscle is so important not only for your performance but also for your health. Simply put, if you have a large amount of muscle, you have a greater potential to produce force. It's that simple, okay? There's an endless amount of research to show that the capacity to produce force is directly linked to the cross-sectional area of that muscle. Now, you may be thinking, well, I don't want to increase a significant amount of muscle mass, whether you're a weight category athlete or someone who's just looking to get stronger. That's absolutely fine. Muscle, however, is not just in reference to creating large muscle, but also addressing the individual contractile characteristics of that muscle, correcting muscle imbalances, and improving your overall body composition. Remember, it's never a downside to have less body fat and more muscle mass. So, why is muscle so important? The cross-sectional area is directly linked to how much force a muscle can produce. To add to that, from a health standpoint, it's easier to maintain a lean body composition with the more muscle mass you have, because muscle is a metabolically active tissue. It demands oxygen when it's at rest. But as an addition as well, if you lack a large amount of muscle mass, and when I say large, I mean it's completely relative to your individual skeletal frame and so on, but if you don't have muscle, it's much harder for your body to perform certain tasks. So you actually expend energy on a global basis if you lack muscle just for simple tasks, such as writing your name down on a piece of paper, carrying the shopping, that type of thing. To dig in a little bit deeper, how do we build muscle? Okay, there are 3, or at least the research is showing at the moment that there is roughly 3 different ways in which we can build muscle. This series is going to be broken down into 3 parts, and today we're going to talk about the one that most people are aware of, which is muscular damage, or also known in the research as EIMD, exercise-induced muscular damage. The typical kind of adage, or the explanation for this, or the anecdote if you will, is you tear the muscle fibers, you rip them apart, they recover, and when they recover they build a little bit larger each time. Let's talk about the effectiveness of that kind of theory, whether or not there is any merit to it, and if that is actually the case. So on a deeper physiological level, going into the nerdy realm now, but on a deeper physiological level, it has been shown that skeletal muscle does actually tear, okay? So there are micro tears on a cellular level that ultimately repair and do eventually grow. However, it's not that simple. When we look at the different contractile characteristics, okay, so when we look at, as we've talked about before within the spectrum of strength video, when we look at the individual contractions, so the eccentrics, the isometrics, and the concentrics, the tearing effect tends to occur within eccentric contractions, okay? And that leads to something known as DOMS, which is what most people are aware of. Delayed onset muscle soreness tends to occur 24 and get a little bit worse 48 hours after a session. And this is typically brought about due to that muscular damage that occurs during eccentric contractions. We also then have something known as a repeated bout effect, okay? And this is the first kind of objection to the muscular damage theory. When we are first exposed to training, we talked about before whether or not training is a productive or a non-productive stress in the eyes of the body. When we are first exposed to training, we know that the body perceives it as a non-productive stress. That's why we get this inflammatory response and the body kind of panics a little bit. Then, on top of that, when we start to get familiar with training, DOMS should actually decrease over time, because we go through what's known as a repeated bout effect, which is essentially the transition from the body seeing stress as non-productive across to. So, is DOMS an indicator of a good workout? Okay, and does it mean that as soon as that DOMS starts to disappear, your training isn't as effective anymore? Well, hopefully you would answer that question with the word no. But if you still err on that side and think that, you know, training is linked to soreness, then I'm going to give you a quick analogy. Okay, so if you did a training session and you, let's say, did legs, you did 3 exercises, 3 sets of 10 on each, just as your typical muscular damage kind of focus. Then you went home, you didn't eat any protein, okay? You didn't get very much sleep, so you only slept for like 3 hours that night, let's say, for whatever reason, okay? You got up the next day, chances are you're going to be pretty sore, yeah? You've done that session, you've done your 9 sets of 10 in total. Now, let's take a second scenario. You did the exact same session, but as soon as you finished, you got in a high protein meal, okay, within 30 minutes to an hour. You then went to do some contrast therapy, so some, you know, hot, cold, that type of thing to promote blood flow. You then went and had another protein meal and then had a massage after it to try and increase the recovery rate. You then got a good solid 8 to 12 hours sleep. Chances are, in the second scenario, you're going to wake up and you're not going to be as sore as the first. But does that mean that the first torn, and so on? Is it a productive stress? Again, over time it does progressively become a productive stress. We know it's not a good indicator. Now, another example of when muscular damage occurs, but it's not necessarily translated to muscular capacity, is with runners. Now, if you speak to a fell runner, for example, okay, particularly people that go through a decent amount of gradient or elevation, where they go through a lot of running downhill in which the eccentric contractions are greater, they will experience a significant amount of DOMs in their legs. But that doesn't mean that runners are walking around looking like bodybuilders and having 24-inch thighs. Okay, so straight away there, just from that kind of observation that we've seen within the research, it shows that exercise-induced muscle damage isn't the only metric that contributes to muscle growth. Because if it was, like I said, every time you ran and every time you had sore legs and every time you'd caused any kind of structural damage to the tissue, it would grow back much thicker, and that's not always the case. So is it even real? Well, ultimately it is, okay, but the mechanism through which it increases muscle mass isn't down to the damage and the growth and the repair cycle necessarily. What we think it's down to, at least from a physiological standpoint, is something known as satellite cell proliferation. So satellite cells are small kind of signaling cells. I won't go into too much detail about it, but signaling cells within the muscle. When your body is placed into an anabolic state, okay, so typically brought about through training, it can be brought about through the ingestion of leucine and so on, but when your muscle protein synthesis elevates, these satellite cells literally sit on the muscle themselves, or rather within, don't quote me on the actual physiology, but they're essentially a beacon for where the protein substrates and where the amino acid structures and all these different mechanisms of increasing muscle mass, where they need to be attributed to. So if there's an area with a massive amount of satellite cells, okay, that's the area that's going to get a significant amount of seeing to, so to speak, from the body in terms of providing growth and repair. And when we look at training protocols that utilize muscle damage or instigate a significant amount of exercise-induced muscle damage, we tend to see this satellite cell number increase over time. But what we need to be aware of is that is on a chronic basis, it's not on an acute basis. Okay, so it's not a case of, you induce a significant amount of muscle damage, 2 sessions later you've got double the amount of satellite cells and you're going to be swole. It's not that simple, okay? It's just, what it essentially is providing the platform through which the body can build muscle when it's exposed to another one of these 3. So when we talk about exercise-induced muscle damage and training protocols that are linked to that, we tend to see that it's linked to 2 primary factors. Number 1, eccentric contractions, and number 2, the total amount of volume that the muscle experiences. And as you'll see when we talk about the other factors of muscle mastery, it's very similar across them as well, in the sense of we tend to see that volume is the key predicting factor. But as we talked about, protocols that induce a significant amount of exercise-induced muscle damage tend to be beneficial because they bring about this satellite cell proliferation. They don't directly transfer over to an increase in muscle mass. So if you're sore, what is the thing that we need to change? Well, simply put, like I said, you can look primarily at increasing the recovery capacity. It's a key factor to remember that we don't get stronger, fitter, bigger, faster in the gym. Okay, we induce a stimulus or a stress response that the body needs to recover from. So if you're working really, really hard, like I see a lot of people do within the gym, and putting in the effort and grafting away, but they don't focus on the recovery side of things as well, they're not going to benefit to the fullest capacity. And you want to be in a scenario in which you're not necessarily significantly sore going into the next training session, because what we do know is exercise-induced muscle damage, or a muscle that has experienced damage that hasn't necessarily fully recovered, its force production capacity has dropped. So if, no matter how tough you think you are in terms of grinding through the soreness and everything, if that muscle is sore and you get it to lift again, it's not going to produce the same amount of force. Now that's not to say you won't lift the weight, it's just to say that it will be closer to its maximum capacity for that day if it is already sore. One thing we need to be aware of is the overall training volume is a key predicting factor, like we've just said, about muscle growth. If your muscles are so sore that you can't train them again, okay, when you need to, your training frequency will drop. And as we know, training frequency is largely based off logistical considerations as well as skill development, but ultimately it contributes to training volume. So if you were supposed to train your chest 3 times that week and you only trained it twice because you were too sore to get the other session in, your total volume has dropped there. So it's just something that we need to be aware of. So just to sum up, the first part of the Muscle Mastery series is muscular damage, exercise-induced muscular damage. We know that the initial kind of theory was that the muscle is torn and it recovers and increases in size. We know that results in delayed onset muscle soreness, and it tends to be brought about through eccentric contractions. We know from the research, however, that it doesn't necessarily translate over to an increase in muscle mass, typically because we can see exercise-induced muscle damage take place in other sporting scenarios such as downhill running that don't necessarily increase the muscle cross-sectional area of that individual. We know that delayed onset muscle soreness isn't an indicator of a good workout, it's an indicator of inadequate recovery, okay, or that the stimulus was too great for that individual to recover from. We know that the repeated bout effect progressively shifts the non-productive stress, which is the soreness scenario, across to a productive one. So you actually want to pursue the notion of not being sore the following day. You still want to work hard, but you ultimately want to progress to that stage. The mechanism, or at least the accepted mechanism at the moment, for why exercise-induced muscle damage contributes to muscle growth is due to this increase in satellite cell proliferation. So the idea that these satellite cells, these homing beacons, so to speak, through which the muscle communicates with the rest of the bodily systems to say that that's where the protein, substrates and everything else need to go, that specific cell increases following an exercise-induced muscle damage based training protocol. Okay guys, hope you enjoyed the discussion on muscle mastery, talking about exercise-induced muscle damage and challenging a few of the beliefs that a lot of people have around this theory. All we've got is 3 questions just to incite a little bit of curiosity from you guys and to see what you've taken in from today's discussion. So, part number 1, can you remember the 2 factors that are linked most closely to exercise-induced muscle damage? Number 2, can you remember what DOMS stands for, and is it an indicator of a good workout? And then finally, number 3, can you remember the mechanism through which we think exercise-induced muscle damage contributes to a growth in muscle? So there is an increase in something that ultimately contributes to an increase in muscle mass, but not necessarily as directly as we thought in the past.